Hi everyone, Robert Kachivara here. We're back with another episode with talking with our good friend H.E. Leon Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Minister Siu and I and many others recently spoke again at the United Nations. You can check out the video here if you missed it. And we've been getting a lot of really good feedback from this, mostly from people who want to be supportive of Hawaii's efforts to restore Hawaii's de facto independence. However, we've also been getting some messages that are critical, mostly from Americans, attempting to say things like the Queen legally gave up Hawaii's rights to independence. So I wanted to ask Minister Siu about this to see what he thinks. Did Hawaii or the Queen give up Hawaii's rights to independence?
No. So the short answer is no. What she signed at first, what people think was a surrender, was not a surrender. It was a yield. And in that yield, she actually stated her position that she is still the monarch. So in that initial letter that Queen Liliuokalani wrote on January 17th, it was a protest to the United States. But wisely, what she did was she said, I yield basically temporarily until such time as the facts become known and I become restored into my position as the head of state for the Hawaiian Kingdom. So it was not a yield, or it was not a surrender, and it was definitely not an abdication. A lot of people confuse that. Now, when a country yields or even surrenders, that does not necessarily mean that the country has disappeared or has now succumbed or has given up its sovereignty. For instance, there's a very, very not popular, but a very, very famous shot of the Japanese surrender on the deck of the Missouri on September 2nd of 1945. That was a surrender. It was an unconditional surrender, but Japan did not lose its sovereignty. It was still a sovereign country. So even an unconditional surrender in time of war does not necessarily mean that the country has ended. So when you talk about Queen Liliuokalani and her filing a protest, that is definitely not a surrender. And then later, in order to save several of her followers from being executed over trumped up charges, she was forced to sign what they call an abdication. The abdication was written by the people who wanted her to sign the abdication, even though it says at the beginning, I do this by my own hand. The interesting thing about that abdication is that the Queen later said, she was forced to do it. So any kind of a forced contract is not a contract, a binding contract, if you're forced to do it. So she was coerced in order to save the lives of her followers. And the other part is that the wrong person signed the abdication, the so-called abdication. It is signed Liliuokalani Dominus, which is not the Queen's legal name. And so by signing it Liliuokalani Dominus, that was not the proper signature for the Queen. So therefore, even if you could say that she signed an abdication, which she said she was forced and coerced into, but even if you got by that, the wrong person signed it. She signed it it wasn't her name that was signed to the paper. And the other interesting sidelight to that is that it was Dole who had approached her to sign this. He was the one who was sent to have her sign this abdication. And he was the one that suggested she signed it Liliuokalani Dominus. So in a way, we don't know exactly why he did that, but it was not a proper signature for that kind of an agreement. So there was no abdication. Later in her memoirs, the Queen, of course, said that she did not abdicate, that this was done under coercion. And now later, after the so-called annexation and after the territory of Hawaii, the Organic Act, then the Queen encouraged her people to go along and do what they needed to do to survive and to go along with the program. But she was not at that time abdicating either. So there was no abdication.
And can you talk about 1993 and the U.S. apology resolution?
Sure. I wanted to mention one other thing about the so-called abdication, and that is there's also an argument that's used often that all these other countries recognize the Republic of Hawaii, therefore the Hawaiian Kingdom was no more. And that actually cannot stand up either, because we do have the treaties that these other countries signed, meaning they would have had to first forswear the treaties. It would have to cancel the treaties before they recognize another sovereign country, another power as sovereign over the Hawaiian Kingdom, which they did not do. So anyway, that's another part. So going to your question about the apology. So in 1893, President Cleveland actually issues an apology. And not only an apology, but a really detailed accounting of what happened at the time. And he made a very strong statement about the United States' role in it, and basically said if it were not for the United States intervention, illegal intervention, the revolution or this coup d'etat would not have taken place. So basically, he says the United States was responsible for the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and it should seek to repair the damage that was done. So he was all for restoring the Hawaiian Kingdom, and actually came to an agreement eventually with the Queen about the restoration. So that was the first apology, and it was a very strong and very clear statement of wrongful action by the United States toward the Hawaiian Kingdom. So 1993 comes around, we're still being occupied by the United States. So for some reason or other, that's kind of a long story, the President of the United States, coming up onto the 100th anniversary of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom, they issue the apology later, but the celebration or the observation of the 100th anniversary took place on January 17th, 1993. On that day, the United Church of Christ, which had been a key player in the overthrow, apologized for its role in the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And the United States actually didn't say anything at that time, but it was on November 23rd of that same year, 1993, so 10 months later, that the United States issued an apology. The apology was structured around the apology that the UCC had put forward, and then embellished upon by the Hawaii delegation. So the Hawaii delegation was able to get this apology passed by the Congress of the United States, both houses of Congress, joint resolution, and then the president signed it on November 23rd, 1993. The signature of the president on a joint resolution makes that joint resolution into a law. So it's now known as U.S. Public Law 103-150. That apology was actually a confession on the part of the United States, saying it was wrong in interfering in the affairs of a foreign state and causing it to fail because of the United States' actions. So they took responsibility for causing the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And of course, they had a lot of other things. They also tried to direct it only to Native Hawaiians, as if only the Native Hawaiian tribal people were affected. And so they stayed away from trying to make this into the overthrow of a nation, of a sovereign independent state. Nevertheless, the implication is that they were wrong in what they did, and therefore they apologized for it. So an apology is actually worth something, that there is an admission, but it's worth nothing if there is no follow-up. So there's an apology, a nice, strong apology, but then there's no follow-up. The follow-up meaning an apology usually has to be followed by acts of repentance or some way to repair the damage that was done. And there has been no acts of repentance or even an attempt to repair the damage. Instead, the United States has been on a tear since the apology to try to force Hawaiians into this pseudo nation called a federal recognized tribe of the United States. Therefore, so what they're trying to do is not to reconcile the situation, but trying to use the apology as a means to say, okay, that's done, let's move on, and now we're going to assign you or create for you this nation status, which is actually a demotion from what we actually have, which is a sovereign status. So after 27 years after the apology, there still has not been a move toward reconciliation or toward restoration of the Hawaiian Kingdom by the United States. We've moved a lot.
Can you talk about Dr. Alfred de Zayas and what he has said about the 1993 apology resolution?
Okay, not only Dr. Alfred de Zayas, but every international lawyer who has seen the apology by the United States consider that to be a full confession of the deed that was done. And they basically say, now you have this confession, you can just simply move forward with your country. And so several people did so. Right after 1993, several groups got together and say, we're restarting the nation. And some of them are still around today. So there is, so what Dr. Alfred de Zayas basically has said is that the apology law compels the United States to honor the Hawaiian Kingdom laws, and that under the laws of occupation, the United States need to be enforcing Hawaiian Kingdom laws and not United States laws in the Hawaiian Islands. So that's basically his position on this. And it's the position of practically every other international lawyer. The problem that we're facing is that there is a block, and we've talked about this before, and that block is the appearance of consent by the people of Hawaii to go along and to become part of the United States as a state of the United States. And that occurred in 1959. And what we're saying was that there was no consent given at that time, and that the vote was wholly fraudulent. And therefore, there was no consent given, and therefore the Hawaiian Kingdom the people of the Hawaiian Kingdom never gave up their sovereignty, still have not given up their sovereignty, and still maintain that they are subjects of the Hawaiian Kingdom.
You mentioned how Dr. de Zayas and other international lawyers have said that the U.S. needs to be enforcing Hawaiian Kingdom laws in Hawaii. So Can you talk more about that? What does that mean?
Yes, okay. The laws of occupation started with the Geneva Convention and the Convention at The Hague, two conventions in the early 20th century. And these conventions basically started to outline the behavior of one country against another one in the area of conflict, particularly if there's wars between, then there's specific behavior that one armed forces has against others. For instance, if they take prisoners, they have to treat the prisoners in a humane way. And the same thing with the civilian population. If a country occupies a foreign state, then they have to treat that civilian population with respect and in a proper way. And they need to enforce the laws of that country while they're occupying that country. So for an example, Japan after World War II, was totally devastated and they had surrendered unconditionally, but they were still a sovereign nation. And the United States was required under the laws of occupation, because the United States became the occupying force in Japan. And the United States was required to administer Japanese laws and to assist the country to get back to the point where they can exercise self-governance. And so that's what the United States did. And so within 5 years, the Japanese government was back on its feet and became once again an independent functioning state. And the US occupation ended. 5 or 6 years it took. The US occupation ended. So same thing with Germany. Germany took a little bit longer because of the divisions that happened in Germany, East and West Germany, and then you had American and British and French in the Western side. But eventually, when Germany was reunited, or all through that occupation time, the laws the laws of occupation required the United States administer the laws of Germany. So, and same with Italy and other countries. So the idea of the laws being administered, the laws of the country being occupied, being administered by the occupying country, is a very, very, I wouldn't say routine, but it's a standard by which everybody understands. So in the case of the Hawaiian Kingdom, the standard has been ignored or has been denied for since the occupation began, which was 1898. That's when the U.S. occupation actually began. So by under the Geneva Convention, the laws of the Hawaiian Kingdom are the laws that should be being administered by the United States here in the Hawaiian Islands, and also they should be not treating Hawaiians as U.S. citizens or forcing Hawaiians to become U.S. citizens, because that's also a violation of the Geneva Convention and the laws of occupation. Also, they should not be taxing Hawaiians living in their own country under occupation. So there are many, many violations that the United States is perpetrating by claiming that Hawaii is part of the United States when we actually are under occupation.
Minister Siu, thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.